Imagine a vacation destination so fiercely protected by law that at any given moment, no more than 400 tourists are legally allowed to set foot on its shores. There are no massive cruise ship terminals, no sprawling mega resorts, and no endless rows of beachfront hotels. If you want to visit, you don't just book a flight. You enter a tightly controlled queue, often waiting years for a licensed bed to open up. Naturally, your first instinct is to assume this is about immigration, sovereignty, or national security borders. But it isn't. This strict government-enforced visitor capilla that defies every standard rule of global tourism economics exists because of an insect. Specifically, a creature that vanished nearly a century ago, thought to be erased from the face of the earth by a single historical catastrophe. What kind of insect possesses enough historical and ecological weight to dictate modern government legislation? And how did a tiny scrap of volcanic land in the middle of the Tasman Sea become the epicenter of one of the most astonishing wildlife rescue missions in human history? To find out, we have to travel roughly 600 kilometres off the eastern coast of mainland Australia, deep into the open blue of the Tasman Sea. In 1788, Lieutenant Henry Lidgard Ball, captaining the HMS Supply, spotted a startling crescent-shaped shadow rising from the ocean. As the ship drew closer, they revealed a dramatic landscape. Twin volcanic mountains, Mount Lidgard and Mount Gower, flanked by sheer cliffs plunging thousands of feet straight into crashing waves, all wrapped around the world's southernmost coral reef. They named it Lord Howe Island because it had evolved in absolute isolation over millions of years, untouched by continental predators. It was a biological sanctuary. Plants, birds, and insects developed here that existed nowhere else on Earth. Many of them completely lost their fear of predators because, quite simply, there had never been any. It was an untouched paradise existing in a state of delicate evolutionary perfection. But paradise is fragile, and all it takes is one broken seal on the door of isolation to shatter an ecosystem forever. That shattering moment arrived on a quiet June day in 1918, disguised as maritime misfortune. A steamship named the SS Makambo ran aground on the coral reefs just off the coast of Lord Howe Island. As the crew worked frantically to stabilize and repair the vessel, an unseen army scrambled down the ropes and onto the pristine shores. Black rats, dozens of them escaping the ship's hold and vanishing directly into the dense, subtropical undergrowth. At the time, the incident was treated as a temporary nuisance, a minor shipping accident on an otherwise remote route, but within months, the true horror of the introduction became clear. Lord Howe Island had no native land mammals to check the rats' expansion, and the island's wildlife had no defenses against them. Ground-nesting birds were slaughtered in their nests. Endemic insects, lizards, and unique invertebrates were systematically hunted down and devoured with terrifying efficiency. Among the casualties was a massive, flightless, nocturnal insect affectionately dubbed the tree lobster, a glossy, black, armor-plated stick insect the size of a human hand. Within a few short years, the devastation was absolute. Surveys declared the insect officially extinct, another tragic casualty of human carelessness meeting island vulnerability. Panic swept through the local community as they watched their unique ecological heritage get eaten alive, sparking a desperate realization. If the island's unique identity was going to survive, the human footprint had to be radically re-engineered. Faced with the creeping threat of total ecological collapse, the community and government took a radical step that flies in the face of modern capitalism. Instead of encouraging endless tourism growth to maximize revenue, they instituted a strict legal carrying capacity. Today, the Lord Howe Island Border Specialized Administrative Body enforces a hard cap of just 400 tourists on the island at any single moment. This isn't managed through vague guidelines or voluntary pledges. It is legally tied to a licensed bed system. There is a fixed number of approved accommodation beds on the entire island, and not a single bed more can be built. Once those 400 slots are filled, the island is effectively full. How does a community survive economically while actively turning away potential tourists? By shifting the model entirely from mass tourism to high-value, low-impact stewardship. Accommodations are premium, stays are intentional, and the local economy thrives on preservation rather than exploitation. This counter-capitalist governance model places nature first and commerce second, creating an ironclad barrier against overdevelopment. But what does this strict legal framework actually look like for someone fortunate enough to secure one of those rare beds? Arriving on Lord Howe Island immediately feels like stepping backward into a slower, more deliberate era. For starters, the primary mode of transportation is the bicycle. Speed limits are low. Walking trails crisscross every square mile, and cars take a definitive backseat to pedestrians and cyclists. Yet the most intense manifestation of the island's environmental law happens before you even leave the airport tarmac. Biosecurity checks are aggressively rigorous. Your baggage, hiking boots, and camping gear are inspected for rogue seeds, soil samples, and, most importantly, stowaway rodents. A single escaped mouse or insect could undo decades of conservation work. Booking a trip requires months, sometimes years of advanced planning, because returning visitors and intentional travelers snap up those limited bed licenses long in advance. It is a place where human freedom is willingly restricted to protect the greater environment. You cannot build a fence without approval. You cannot clear land at a whim, and every drop of water and watt of electricity is monitored with care. Yet, beneath this peaceful daily rhythm, a whispered legend persisted. Up on a jagged vertical rock spire jutting out of the open ocean just miles away, something impossible was rumored to still be alive. About 23 kilometres southeast of Lord Howe Island rises Ball's Pyramid. It is the tallest volcanic sea stack in the world, a sheer, needle-like blade of basalt, shooting 562 straight up out of the churning waters of the Tasman Sea, looking less like a geological formation and more like the tooth of an ancient sea monster. For decades, passing fishermen had whispered about seeing strange, large insects clinging to the sparse vegetation, clinging to the cliff face. Dead specimens had even been found washed up or tucked into rock crevices, sparking wild theories among entomologists. Could the tree lobster, written off as extinct for over 80 years, actually be clinging to survival on a vertical rock spire in the middle of the open ocean? In 2001, a daring scientific expedition set out to find the truth. Armed with climbing gear, flashlights, and quiet skepticism, researchers scaled the sheer, crumbling rock face under the cover of darkness, the only time these nocturnal insects emerge from hiding. Clinging to a single lonely melaleuca bush rooted in a tiny crack 500 feet above the crashing surf, they found them. Not hundreds, not dozens, but a tiny, fragile colony of just 24 living individuals. An insect, thought to be lost to history, had survived against impossible odds, holding onto a vertical cliff like a biological flag of defiance. Finding the insects on Ball's Pyramid was only the first step of a heart-stopping rescue mission. Leaving them on that single, vulnerable bush threatened by rockfalls, storms, and sheer attrition was not an option. A daring extraction plan brought a handful of the surviving specimens back to the mainland, most notably to the Melbourne Zoo, where expert breeders faced a monumental challenge. No one had ever bred this specific species in captivity before. They had to meticulously reverse engineer the insect's natural diet, humidity requirements, and nocturnal habits in laboratory terrariums. Miraculously, the breeding program succeeded, multiplying the population from a handful of survivors into thousands. Simultaneously, back on Lord Howe Island, authorities launched one of the most complex eradication operations in conservation history, dropping specialized bait to entirely clear the island of the invasive black rats that had ruined the ecosystem nearly a century prior. With the predators gone, the stage is set for the ultimate homecoming, reintroducing the tree lobster back to the forests of Lord Howe Island, allowing a wrongfully exiled species to finally reclaim its ancestral home. When you look back at Lord Howe Island, you realize it represents something far greater than just a restricted holiday destination. It is a living blueprint for what happens when a community decides that endless economic growth is not the ultimate measure of civilization. By enforcing a strict visitor cap of 400 people, tightly regulating daily life, and fighting tooth and nail to bring a single species back from the brink of oblivion. This tiny island teaches the rest of a growth-obsessed world a profound lesson. True stewardship isn't about conquering nature. It is about having the discipline to step back, draw a line, and protect the fragile web of life that was here long before us, and will hopefully remain long after we are gone.